The morning had started like any other at the sprawling Brentwood estate. Sunlight spilled across manicured lawns, the distant hum of Los Angeles traffic barely audible over the rustle of palm fronds. Birds chirped, dogs barked, and the world outside was blissfully unaware of the darkness brewing behind the walls of one of the city's most prominent homes. Rob Reiner, aged 78, a man whose name carried decades of Hollywood acclaim, and Michelle Reiner, 70, elegant, dignified, the kind of woman whose presence seemed to illuminate every room she entered, were alive, or so everyone thought. But appearances can be deceiving. The truth, as it often does, lurked in the shadows, waiting for a moment to explode into the open. And that morning, nothing would remain hidden. What happened next would send shockwaves across the nation. A son, a family, a home. Everything ordinary about this picture-perfect life was shattered in an instant. Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son, would be arrested that same night. 2 counts of first-degree murder. The words alone seemed almost too monstrous to comprehend, yet the evidence would make it undeniable. But before we get there, before the chilling details of the crime, there was the discovery that left even seasoned investigators speechless. What was found hidden behind a bedroom wall? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine standing in a room that has been part of your life for decades, walls that have seen birthdays, celebrations, ordinary conversations. Now, imagine discovering that those same walls have been hiding something so horrifying that your understanding of reality, of family, of trust, is forever altered. That is exactly what happened in the Reiner household. To understand the gravity of this story, one must first understand the family. Rob and Michelle were not just names. They were a brand, a fixture in social circles where wealth and influence mingled with power. Yet within this polished exterior, there existed tension, whispers, and secrets that no one outside the home could have imagined. Friends described the Reiners as kind, generous, almost impossibly perfect. But as is often the case, perfection can mask the deepest cracks. The day the bodies were discovered, it was their daughter Romy, 27, who found them. Romy, who had grown up witnessing both the love and the undercurrents of unease in her family, called the authorities in a state of panic. She spoke of a dangerous family member, a warning that initially seemed almost too bizarre to take seriously. But those words, as investigators would later admit, were prophetic. Romy's voice, trembling over the phone, would become one of the first clues that something profoundly dark had been unfolding behind the serene facade of the Brentwood estate. Behind the bedroom wall, investigators would uncover a scene that seemed ripped from the most harrowing of crime dramas. A 12-year-old girl in chains, confined to a small, hidden space, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. How could such a thing exist in the home of a family so publicly respected, so seemingly ordinary? How could a child be trapped, silent, invisible, while the world outside believed life was continuing normally? The implications were staggering. Questions arose instantly. Was the girl related to the family? How long had she been there? How had no one suspected anything? And most chillingly, who had orchestrated this nightmare? Every answer only seemed to raise more questions, and every step closer to the truth revealed just how much had been carefully concealed. At this point, it is essential to pause and consider the human element. These were not anonymous victims. They were real people, with lives, with histories, with relationships that spanned decades. Rob and Michelle Reiner had careers, friendships, reputations. They had built a home, a life, and yet, that life had become a cage for terror and betrayal. And Romy, forced to confront the unimaginable in her own home, bore witness to what no child should ever see. From the moment the crime scene was secured, law enforcement faced a puzzle unlike any other. The luxurious guest house, where Nick lived, became a focus. Investigators had to untangle layers of secrecy to decipher clues that were hidden in plain sight. Every family dynamic, every conversation, every prior incident suddenly took on new meaning. Neighbors reported seeing the family in ordinary moments, waving from windows, gardening in the sun. They had no idea that within those walls, a story of horror was unfolding. And then there was the media. As news of the murders and the shocking discovery behind the bedroom wall broke, it ignited a frenzy. Social media exploded with speculation, theories, and outrage. The story gripped the nation because it touched on something deeply unsettling. The idea that horror can exist right next door, behind the doors of homes that seem ordinary, unassuming. We like to believe that the world is safe, that families protect one another, that children are nurtured and loved. The Reiner case shattered that illusion in an instant. But why was this story so compelling? Beyond the shock, beyond the fear, it tapped into universal themes: betrayal, secrecy, the fragility of trust. People were horrified not just because of the violence, but because it happened in a setting that epitomized security and success. It happened in a house that should have been a sanctuary, in the home of a family whose lives seemed enviable to outsiders. And yet, the nightmare had been hiding behind a simple bedroom wall, invisible until the day it could no longer remain concealed. The investigation would reveal meticulous planning, an almost methodical approach to concealment. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency was a potential clue. And yet, even with the evidence mounting, the questions that gripped the public's imagination were far more personal. How could a family harbor such darkness? Could love and cruelty exist side by side? What does this say about the people we think we know best? This story is not just about murder. It is about the human capacity for deception, for cruelty, and for the preservation of appearances at all costs. It is about the moments when ordinary life intersects with unspeakable evil. And it is about the resilience of those who, like Romy, are forced to confront these truths head-on, bearing witness to horrors that most of us can only imagine. As the investigation unfolded, every detail seemed to point in multiple directions at once. The luxurious estate, the hidden guest house, the behavior of family members, all became pieces of a puzzle that was as complicated as it was tragic. The 12-year-old girl, the warnings, the hidden wall, they were not just incidental details. They were central to understanding the full scope of what had occurred, and they demanded answers. And here is where the story pivots from tragedy to horror. The realization that what investigators found behind the wall was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of secrets that had been carefully guarded for years. Every moment leading up to the discovery, every family argument, every unexplained absence, every warning unheeded, all led to that one terrifying revelation. By now, the audience may be asking themselves, could this happen in my neighborhood? In my family? It's that very question, the uncomfortable, haunting thought, that keeps people glued to the story, even as the details grow darker with each passing hour. The Reiners had a reputation that many envied. To the outside world, Rob and Michelle epitomized the American dream: success, stability, wealth, and influence, all wrapped in the glossy veneer of a perfect family. Rob Reiner, a man whose name carried decades of Hollywood clout, had always been described as charismatic, clever, and magnetic. Michelle, graceful and composed, was equally admired, the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Together, they projected the image of balance, a family that had it all. But anyone who studies human behavior quickly learns that appearances can be deceiving. The glamorous photos, the laughter at holiday gatherings, the smiling family portraits, they all masked the subtle tensions that simmered just beneath the surface. Every family has its disagreements, of course, but in the Reiner household, those disagreements sometimes turned into undercurrents of distrust, secrecy, and silent conflict. Romy, the daughter who would later stumble upon the horror in her own home, had grown up observing these dynamics. She noticed the subtle cues, the sharp tone in an otherwise polite conversation, the cold glances exchanged over trivial matters, the way certain topics were avoided altogether. To most casual observers, these were inconsequential, perhaps the normal friction of family life. To Romy, however, they were indicators of something far more serious. Patterns of control, manipulation, and underlying tension that no one outside the home could see. Nick, the son who would later become the central figure in this tragedy, was a complex character. On the surface, he appeared like any other young man, polite, capable, seemingly integrated into the rhythm of family life. But as any criminal psychologist will attest, surface-level normalcy often conceals inner turbulence. Those close to him reported bouts of isolation, unexplained anger, and periods of intense secrecy. No one could have predicted, not even those who loved him most, how far those tendencies would eventually escalate. The house itself was a reflection of the family. Every room spoke of careful curation, of wealth and taste, of a desire to project stability and warmth. Yet even in this luxurious space, cracks were forming. The guest house, where Nick lived, was a smaller, more private section of the property, separated from the main house. It was ostensibly for privacy and convenience, but in hindsight, it would serve as a critical piece in the unfolding tragedy. The separation, intended as a feature of comfort, would ultimately become a mechanism for concealment. Neighbors recalled seeing the family together, laughing at weekend barbecues, attending local events, maintaining the facade of an idyllic suburban life. The contrast between public appearances and private reality is often jarring in cases like this. While everyone outside saw harmony, inside the home, subtle battles for control were waged daily. The Reiners' lives were not devoid of love. They were filled with it, but love had been tangled with fear, obligation, and hidden resentment. Psychologists studying family dynamics emphasize that such complexities are rarely visible to outsiders. The Reiner story is a stark illustration of that principle. The juxtaposition of warmth and hostility, affection and intimidation, secrecy and openness, created a volatile environment that would eventually explode into tragedy. Romy had been acutely aware of these tensions, even as a child. She had witnessed arguments that left emotional scars, and she had learned, perhaps too early, that appearances could be dangerously misleading. As the years passed, Romy's observations became more acute. She noticed patterns, doors that were locked unnecessarily, conversations cut short, moments of unexplained anxiety in her parents' expressions. She also noticed the growing distance between her brother and the rest of the family. Nick seemed increasingly absorbed in his own world, retreating into privacy and isolation. While parents often give their children space, this was different. It was not mere independence. It was withdrawal, a pull away from connection that would have devastating consequences. The family's social circle reinforced the illusion of normalcy. Friends admired the Reiners, often remarking on their hospitality, generosity, and charm. Parties were lavish, dinners meticulously prepared, and the family was seen as an anchor in the social community. And yet, beneath this polished exterior, the seeds of betrayal were taking root. The juxtaposition of public admiration and private dysfunction created an environment ripe for catastrophe, a classic scenario where outward appearances mask inward turmoil. The narrative of the Reiners' life, however, is not just about tension, it is also about human complexity. Rob and Michelle were, in many ways, good people, devoted to each other, to their children, and to the life they had built. But good intentions can coexist with tragic oversights. In their desire to maintain appearances, they inadvertently allowed certain patterns to grow unchecked. The very house that symbolized stability would become a place where secrets were hidden, both physically and psychologically. In hindsight, there were signs, subtle though they were, that hinted at the storm to come. Friends had occasionally mentioned worrying about Nick, remarking on his solitude, on moments of unexplained frustration, on behaviors that suggested he struggled to connect with reality. No one, however, could have predicted the magnitude of the darkness that would emerge. Often, the most alarming patterns are dismissed until it is too late, a bitter lesson that resonates painfully in cases like this. The role of Romy in this story is central. As the daughter who discovered the bodies, she was uniquely positioned to witness both the facade and the hidden reality. Her perspective offers insight into the duality of the Reiner household: love and fear, beauty and horror, normalcy and chaos, all existing side by side. She had grown up understanding the subtleties of her family's dynamics, and it was this understanding that would make her both a witness and a key figure in unraveling the truth. Romy's discovery was not just a moment of personal tragedy, it was a collision with the unimaginable. For decades, the Reiner family had maintained a careful balance, projecting perfection while managing their internal conflicts privately. That balance, however, was fragile, and it had been disrupted in the most violent of ways. The discovery of the hidden girl, the bodies of Rob and Michelle, and the evidence pointing to Nick's involvement shattered the illusion entirely, leaving a narrative that was both horrifying and mesmerizing to the public. The question that lingers in the minds of investigators, psychologists, and the public alike is simple but profound. How could a family, outwardly so ordinary and admired, harbor such darkness? It is a question that refuses to yield a simple answer. Human behavior is complex, and the Reiner's story illustrates that complexity in stark, unforgettable detail. And yet, even in the midst of tragedy, there were glimpses of humanity. Romy's courage in discovering the bodies and reporting them to authorities demonstrated resilience in the face of horror. The investigators' methodical work, piecing together the sequence of events, reflected the commitment to uncovering truth even when it was painful and grotesque. These elements, woven into the narrative, reveal not just the depth of the crime, but also the resilience and dedication of those confronting it. The Reiner family's life, full of apparent glamour and concealed tension, sets the stage for what would follow. Understanding this backdrop is essential to comprehending the magnitude of the events that would unfold. It is within this tension between appearance and reality that the tragedy becomes both compelling and horrifying. A story that captivates the nation precisely because it could not have been predicted, and yet, in retrospect, was written into the subtle cues of daily life. As we move forward into the details of the day of the tragedy, one must keep in mind the duality of the Reiners' existence. They were, at once, a family admired by many and a household harboring secrets no one could have imagined. That duality is central to the narrative, and it is what makes the story both shocking and compelling. And yet, even now, as we recount the life and dynamics of the Reiner family, the most chilling revelations remain just beyond reach. What was behind the bedroom wall? What horrors had been concealed in plain sight? And how would the discovery of these secrets redefine our understanding of a family that had seemed, to so many, flawless? Sunday, December 15th, began like any other morning at the Reiner estate. Sunlight poured into the windows of the Brentwood mansion, casting warm golden hues across the polished floors and carefully arranged furniture. Outside, the city of Los Angeles continued its usual rhythm. Cars honking, joggers passing by, the faint scent of coffee wafting from nearby cafes. But inside the Reiner home, an ordinary day was about to spiral into unimaginable horror. Rob and Michelle had followed their usual routine. Rob, ever methodical, spent the morning reviewing paperwork, answering a few emails, and planning meetings for the week ahead. Michelle, meticulous in her habits, attended to household management, checking schedules for the house staff, coordinating deliveries, and tending to the estate's numerous obligations. Their son, Nick, was in the guest house, seemingly absorbed in his own world. The daughter, Romy, had her own plans for the day, but the family had planned to reconvene for lunch. A typical Sunday meal that, until that moment, seemed as unremarkable as any other. The calm, however, was deceptive. Those who have studied crime and tragedy often note that the ordinary moments, the mundane, predictable actions, are precisely when the extraordinary can erupt. It is in the rhythm of normal life that hidden tensions grow unnoticed, that resentments simmer silently, and that plans, however sinister, move forward with quiet inevitability. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came from Romy. She had intended to check in with her parents that morning, a casual visit to the main house, before heading out for errands. When she entered, she was met with silence. Not the kind of silence that accompanies solitude or quiet reflection, but a suffocating, unnatural stillness. The house seemed almost frozen in time, as if it were holding its breath. Romy called out to her parents, her voice echoing through the halls. No response came. At first, she assumed they were occupied, perhaps in a private conversation, or that one of them had stepped outside. But intuition, often a more reliable guide than logic in moments of crisis, told her that something was off. She moved deeper into the house, following the familiar path toward the areas where her parents were usually found. It was in the main bedroom that the horror revealed itself. Rob and Michelle lay on the floor, lifeless, their bodies bearing the unmistakable marks of violent assault. Shock and disbelief seized Romy. Her mind struggled to reconcile the scene before her with the parents she had known, loved, and trusted. This was not a scene from a movie, not a distant story from the news. It was her reality, immediate and inescapable. The discovery triggered a flood of conflicting emotions: grief, anger, fear, and confusion. Who could have done this? Why? And how could such violence occur within the walls of a home that had always seemed so safe? These questions raced through Romy's mind even as she reached for her phone, trembling, to call 911. The response was swift. Within minutes, police officers and emergency responders arrived at the Brentwood estate. They were met with a scene that immediately demanded a meticulous approach. Crime scene investigators began cataloging evidence, photographing the scene, and documenting every detail. In cases like this, every movement, every object, every irregularity can be critical to understanding the sequence of events. As investigators combed the property, attention inevitably turned to the guest house where Nick lived. He was taken into custody for questioning. At this stage, law enforcement had yet to formally identify him as the primary suspect, but the circumstances surrounding his presence and his proximity to the events could not be ignored. Friends and neighbors were stunned. Many described Nick as quiet, polite, and somewhat reserved, but no one could have anticipated that he might be capable of such acts. The investigation quickly uncovered additional layers of complexity. Among the most shocking discoveries was the existence of a hidden space behind a bedroom wall. Investigators, acting on subtle clues and anomalies noticed during their initial sweep, removed a section of the wall. What they found defied comprehension. A 12-year-old girl, confined and chained, living in conditions that spoke of neglect, fear, and prolonged captivity. The discovery of the child transformed the investigation from a murder case into a story of captivity, concealment, and deep-seated familial dysfunction. Questions multiplied exponentially. How long had the girl been held there? What was her connection to the family? And how had such a crime remained hidden within a household that appeared, from the outside, ordinary and secure? As news of the tragedy spread, the public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media exploded with speculation, outrage, and fear. Journalists scrambled to gather information, neighbors were interviewed, and experts weighed in on the psychological and social dimensions of the crime. The story resonated because it touched on a primal fear. That danger could exist not in distant places, but right next door, hidden behind the walls of homes we consider safe. In addition to the shock of the murders themselves, the public was captivated by the revelations about the hidden girl. Her presence raised uncomfortable questions about vigilance, trust, and the assumptions we make about family life. How could such a situation have persisted unnoticed? What signs had been missed? And what does it say about the nature of secrecy and deception in families, even those that seem outwardly perfect? Investigators faced the daunting task of reconstructing the events leading to the murders. They analyzed communications, reviewed security footage, interviewed friends and acquaintances, and examined physical evidence in painstaking detail. Every detail mattered, from the placement of objects to the timing of movements, from behavioral patterns to inconsistencies in testimony. The complexity of the investigation highlighted the intersection of ordinary life and extraordinary criminal behavior. On the surface, the Reiner family had lived in luxury, engaged in social activities, and maintained relationships that appeared normal. Beneath the surface, however, there were tensions, secrets, and actions that ultimately culminated in violence and concealment. This contrast between appearance and reality is one of the most disturbing aspects of the story. For Romy, the day of the tragedy was only the beginning of a long and painful journey. She would have to navigate grief, fear, and the public spotlight while assisting investigators in piecing together the truth. Her courage in the face of horror would become a critical element of the narrative, providing insight into the resilience of individuals confronting unimaginable circumstances. And yet, even as authorities worked tirelessly, one question remained central: why? Why would a son turn on his parents? And why would a child be imprisoned in the very house meant to provide safety and love? The answer was not immediately apparent. The investigation would reveal layers of motive, planning, and psychological factors that painted a picture more complex and more horrifying than anyone could have anticipated. The day of the tragedy ended with more questions than answers. The bodies of Rob and Michelle had been discovered, the child rescued, and the initial suspect taken into custody. But the hidden truths behind the bedroom wall, the nature of the family dynamics, and the full scope of the horrors within the estate remained elusive. The stage was set for revelations that would continue to shock investigators, journalists, and the public alike. The moment the authorities focused their attention on Nick Reiner, the narrative of the tragedy shifted. Suddenly, the story was no longer only about the shocking deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner or the harrowing discovery of the 12-year-old girl. It became, in part, the story of a son whose actions would leave an entire nation in disbelief. Nick, the 32-year-old son of a prominent family, now stood at the center of a storm he could not escape. On the surface, Nick had always seemed like an ordinary young man. Polite, reserved, and somewhat distant, he had carved a private life within the family's sprawling Brentwood estate. He lived in the guest house, separate from the main family residence, a detail that at the time appeared convenient and unremarkable. The guest house, isolated yet close enough to remain connected, allowed for privacy, a luxury afforded by wealth. But as investigators would soon realize, that very separation had provided the space to conceal actions that no one could have predicted. Nick's history revealed a man of contradictions. Friends and acquaintances described him as intelligent and articulate, capable of charm and social grace. At the same time, those who knew him intimately occasionally noted troubling behavior, periods of isolation, sudden irritability, and intense secrecy. These observations, scattered and subtle, were easy to dismiss at the time. After all, many young adults exhibit some level of independence or private behavior. But in hindsight, these traits were part of a pattern that hinted at deeper issues. Psychologists specializing in criminal behavior note that outward normalcy often masks inner turmoil. In Nick's case, the discrepancy between appearance and reality would prove to be both profound and tragic. The polite young man his neighbors saw was capable of acts that contradicted every expectation of familial loyalty and moral decency. The challenge for investigators, and for the public trying to comprehend the story, was understanding how someone raised in comfort, privilege, and apparent love could commit acts of extreme violence and cruelty. Nick's relationship with his parents had always been complicated. On the surface, it resembled a typical family dynamic. Guidance, correction, occasional conflict, and underlying affection. But as is often the case, the true nature of a parent-child relationship can be far more complex. Subtle tensions, long-held resentments, and unspoken disagreements can fester over years, creating a psychological landscape that, if left unexamined, may contribute to catastrophic outcomes. Investigators examining Nick's life began to piece together a picture of behavior that suggested both premeditation and concealment. Communications, social interactions, and patterns of movement within the estate all indicated a meticulous attention to privacy. Certain doors were locked, certain rooms avoided, and certain routines rigidly observed. This attention to detail, once perceived as merely private or reserved behavior, would later be seen as instrumental in executing the acts that led to the deaths of his parents and the captivity of the young girl. The arrest of Nick Reiner was swift, occurring the same night as the discovery of his parents' bodies. Authorities charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder, a decision supported by immediate evidence and the severity of the crime. Yet the arrest raised as many questions as it answered. How had Nick managed to carry out such acts within a household constantly under observation by family, staff, and neighbors? How could he have maintained secrecy long enough to orchestrate events without detection? And, perhaps most disturbingly, what motivated him to commit these acts against the very people who had nurtured and supported him throughout his life? Experts in family dynamics and criminal psychology suggest that multiple factors often converge in cases like this. There may be a combination of unresolved personal grievances, psychological disorders, and situational pressures that, when compounded, can lead to violent outcomes. In Nick's case, investigators would later examine financial motives, interpersonal conflicts, and behavioral patterns that suggested both premeditation and a chilling lack of empathy. Each factor contributed to a narrative that was as unsettling as it was complex. Friends and extended family were stunned. Many had interacted with Nick for years, attending holidays, social gatherings, and family events without any inkling of the darkness that would erupt. The cognitive dissonance between their perception of Nick and the reality of his actions created a ripple of disbelief and grief. How could someone so familiar, so present, be capable of such cruelty? This tension between expectation and reality would become a central theme in the public discourse surrounding the case. Compounding the shock was the discovery of the hidden 12-year-old girl. Nick's proximity to the space where she was confined, combined with his role in the household, raised questions about his involvement. While authorities initially focused on the murders, the child's captivity added a layer of psychological and moral horror that intensified scrutiny on Nick. Questions about control, coercion, and manipulation became central to understanding the full scope of his behavior. The process of investigation revealed meticulous patterns in Nick's daily life. Investigators analyzed phone records, surveillance footage, and interactions with household staff. They discovered instances of deliberate avoidance, strategic movement within the property, and careful management of perception. These findings suggested a calculated approach to his activities, challenging any narrative that might frame his actions as impulsive or uncontrolled. At the same time, the investigation uncovered disturbing contradictions. Nick, the son who had appeared reserved and compliant, had a series of behaviors and choices that clashed with his public persona. Reports from friends and acquaintances highlighted moments of anger, withdrawal, and secrecy that, in retrospect, hinted at a deeper psychological disturbance. These contradictions became a focal point for experts attempting to understand the motivations and mindset behind the crimes. Public fascination with Nick Reiner was immediate and intense. The idea that a son could murder both parents and participate in the concealment of a child's captivity was almost too horrific to process. Media outlets emphasized the incongruity of wealth, privilege, and violence, and social media users speculated about motives, psychological state, and future legal outcomes. This intense focus magnified the human dimension of the tragedy, transforming Nick from a private individual into a symbol of betrayal and horror. The question of motive remained central. Was this about money, control, revenge, or something far darker, rooted in psychological compulsion? Investigators would continue to explore every possibility, examining family interactions, financial records, and personal communications. The answers, however, were not immediately apparent. The complexity of human behavior, particularly within the insulated environment of a wealthy and private household, made definitive conclusions elusive. As the days following the tragedy unfolded, Nick's role in the story became increasingly scrutinized. Every action, every decision, and every interaction was examined through the lens of what had occurred. Friends and family struggled to reconcile the image of Nick they had known with the reality of his alleged actions. Psychologists emphasize the difficulty of predicting violent behavior, particularly when it emerges within a familiar and seemingly stable environment. Nick Reiner, once an ordinary young man living quietly in a guest house, had become the focal point of a narrative that encompassed murder, captivity, secrecy, and betrayal. His life, actions, and psyche were now under public, legal, and investigative scrutiny. Understanding his role is essential to comprehending the full scope of the Reiner tragedy, because it illuminates not only the mechanics of the crime, but also the complex interplay of personality, motive, and circumstance that made it possible. And yet, even with Nick in custody and under investigation, the story was far from complete. The hidden wall, the 12-year-old girl, and the remaining secrets of the household suggested that there were still layers to uncover, revelations that would continue to shock investigators, family members, and the public. In any investigation, the ordinary details of a house can conceal extraordinary truths. Floors creak, walls hold echoes of conversations long past, and rooms can hide secrets that no one dares to imagine. In the Reiner estate, a bedroom wall, seemingly unremarkable, part of the main house for decades, would become the centerpiece of a revelation that stunned the nation. What was behind that wall would transform a story of murder into something far more complex, chilling, and horrifying. The investigation had already revealed the shocking deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner and the arrest of Nick, their son. But authorities knew that in cases involving domestic homicide, the initial crime is rarely isolated. Investigators begin to look for patterns, anomalies, anything out of place that might offer a clue to motive or concealment. It was during this meticulous sweep that they noticed something unusual about the bedroom wall, a subtle irregularity in texture, a slight discoloration, an almost imperceptible hollow sound when tapped. At first glance, it seemed insignificant. To anyone untrained, it was just a wall. Yet to seasoned investigators, such anomalies are never ignored. They suggest the possibility of concealed spaces, hidden compartments, or structural modifications that might not align with the original blueprint of a house. In homes like the Reiners, where luxury and customization are standard, such anomalies could easily be dismissed, but trained eyes know better. The lead investigator, methodical and careful, decided to pursue the anomaly. Tools were brought in to measure, probe, and test the integrity of the wall. Every detail was recorded, every sound analyzed. The process was slow, deliberate, and tense. A wall is more than just drywall. It is a barrier between rooms, between people, and sometimes between reality and the unimaginable. When the first panel was carefully removed, the room behind it came into view. Investigators froze. The space was small, narrow, and hidden from plain sight, essentially invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the property. But what immediately caught attention was not just the confined nature of the room. It was what, or rather who, was inside. A 12-year-old girl, chained and terrified, was discovered within the hidden space. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear and confusion. The conditions of the room were stark: minimal light, no ventilation, and clear signs of prolonged confinement. This was not a space intended for comfort. It was a space of concealment, control, and abuse. The realization struck the investigators hard. They were not merely dealing with a double homicide. They were confronting a case of child captivity within the very walls of the home they had been investigating. The immediate questions were overwhelming. How long had the child been confined there? What was her relationship to the family? How had this been allowed to continue unnoticed? And perhaps most chillingly, who was responsible for her imprisonment? Each question was a thread leading deeper into the disturbing fabric of the household. Authorities took the child into immediate care. Social services and medical personnel were called to ensure her safety, provide emergency treatment, and begin the process of psychological stabilization. In cases like this, the emotional trauma is often as severe as any physical evidence. The child's account, her first words to investigators, would become central to understanding the full scope of the crime. While the child was being attended to, forensic experts began documenting the hidden room. Fingerprints, DNA samples, and traces of objects within the space were cataloged. Every item became evidence, every mark potentially crucial. Investigators knew that in domestic crime cases, the environment itself often holds the key to understanding motive, timing, and execution. Walls, floors, ceilings, and hidden compartments are more than physical structures. They are witnesses. And in this instance, the wall had borne silent witness to months, perhaps years, of horror. Media outlets quickly caught wind of the discovery, although details were initially withheld to protect the child's identity. Rumors spread, speculation ran rampant, and the public was gripped by both curiosity and horror. The story had transformed from a shocking double homicide into a complex, layered narrative of captivity, deception, and betrayal. The psychological implications were profound. Experts noted that the child's confinement suggested careful planning and control by the perpetrator. This was not an impulsive act. It required forethought, concealment, and ongoing maintenance. The existence of the hidden room raised questions about family dynamics, supervision, and awareness. How could a child be hidden in plain sight while adults lived seemingly ordinary lives around her? Neighbors, when interviewed, expressed disbelief. Many had passed the house daily, attended nearby events, or spoken casually with the family, completely unaware that such a space existed. The hidden room challenged assumptions about safety, visibility, and perception. It forced people to confront a terrifying reality. Appearances can be profoundly misleading, even in settings of wealth and apparent security. Investigators were methodical in reconstructing the child's confinement. They looked for signs of ingress and egress, checked for tools, locks, or modifications that would facilitate concealment. The wall itself became a key piece of evidence. Its construction, the placement of panels, and the design of hinges and fasteners all suggested an intentional and sustained effort to hide something, or someone, from view. As the investigation progressed, authorities began to connect the hidden room to other elements of the case. Patterns of family interaction, reports from Romy about unusual behaviors, and previous complaints or warnings suddenly took on new meaning. The room was not just a secret space. It was a nexus that linked motive, opportunity, and execution in ways that were both intricate and chilling. Public fascination continued to grow. The idea that a child could be hidden behind a wall in a luxurious home captivated attention, spurred speculation, and intensified the narrative's emotional resonance. Audiences were drawn not only to the shock of the crime, but to the deeper questions it raised about trust, observation, and the hidden dimensions of domestic life. Even among investigators, the discovery provoked a mix of horror and professional urgency. They knew that each passing hour without answers increased the potential for trauma, evidence loss, and misinterpretation. The hidden room was not just a physical space. It was the key to understanding the scope and gravity of the Reiner family tragedy. By the time the initial sweep was complete, the implications were clear. This case was far more than a double homicide. It involved child captivity, long-term concealment, and a level of premeditation that challenged even the most experienced professionals. Every detail mattered, every anomaly was critical, and every question led to yet another layer of complexity. The discovery of the hidden room behind the bedroom wall had already sent shockwaves through investigators, law enforcement, and the media, but nothing could have prepared anyone for the reality of what, or rather who, they found inside. A 12-year-old girl, confined, chained, and terrified, was living in conditions that defied comprehension. The sight of her, pale and trembling, her eyes wide with fear, immediately reframed the investigation. This was no longer only a case of murder. This was a story of captivity, control, and prolonged cruelty. A story that demanded answers not only about who had committed the crimes, but also about how such horror could exist within a family home. From the very first moments, the girl's condition was alarming. Her body bore signs of neglect and long-term restraint. Marks from chains and restricted movement were visible on her wrists and ankles. She was underweight, fatigued, and emotionally fragile, responding to the sudden presence of strangers with a mixture of fear and confusion. Trauma specialists were called to the scene immediately. They knew that, in addition to physical recovery, the girl would need psychological stabilization to begin processing the events she had endured. The initial interactions with the girl were slow and cautious. Law enforcement approached her gently, aware that any sudden movements or intimidating gestures could trigger panic or defensive behavior. They asked simple, non-threatening questions: her name, her age, her recollection of the immediate events. Every answer, every pause, every hesitant glance was cataloged meticulously. The investigators understood that the child's testimony, when properly guided and supported, could provide crucial insight into the sequence of events leading up to her confinement. The room itself spoke volumes. Its construction revealed deliberate design choices intended to keep the girl hidden and controlled. Minimal light, poor ventilation, and the rigid placement of chains suggested that this was not a temporary measure. Whoever had placed her there had intended to maintain secrecy over an extended period. The investigators noted small details: scratches on the walls from attempts to escape, remnants of food and water containers, and traces of items used for basic hygiene, all of which painted a picture of prolonged captivity. As word of the discovery reached the public, disbelief quickly turned to outrage. Viewers, readers, and online commentators were united in their shock that a child could be hidden in plain sight, in a home where neighbors, friends, and family members might have passed by without noticing. The story tapped into a universal fear: that the spaces we assume to be safe, particularly our homes, might conceal unspeakable horrors. The emotional impact of the revelation intensified as further details emerged, including the girl's young age and the conditions in which she had been kept. The girl's initial accounts were fragmented, as is often the case with victims of prolonged captivity. Trauma can cloud memory, making it difficult to recall events in a linear fashion. Investigators worked carefully to piece together her story, using techniques designed to reduce stress and avoid re-traumatization. They began to understand that the girl had been confined for weeks, possibly months, and that her captor had gone to great lengths to ensure she remained hidden. Medical professionals conducted a thorough examination, documenting injuries consistent with confinement and restraint. The presence of chains, restricted movement, and limited access to basic necessities suggested an intentional pattern of abuse. These findings not only informed the criminal investigation, but also provided critical information for the girl's immediate care and rehabilitation. Her physical and psychological well-being became a priority, even as the larger questions of motive and culpability continued to dominate the investigation. One of the most troubling aspects of the discovery was the psychological impact on the girl. Children in captivity often develop complex trauma responses, including hypervigilance, emotional detachment, and intense fear of authority figures. The investigators and specialists recognized the importance of establishing trust, speaking calmly, and providing reassurance that she was now safe. The child's reactions, hesitation, sudden flinches, and tears, were not signs of defiance, but of survival instincts honed over a period of confinement and uncertainty. As the investigation progressed, the question of responsibility became unavoidable. The proximity of Nick Reiner to the hidden room raised immediate concerns about his involvement. Investigators examined the design and access points of the room, the timing of movements within the house, and any potential evidence linking him to the girl's captivity. While the murders of Rob and Michelle were the initial focus, the presence of a child in chains suggested premeditation, planning, and a disturbing level of control over another human being. The public reaction intensified with each new detail. News outlets highlighted the contrast between the luxurious setting of the Reiner estate and the grim conditions of the hidden room. Social media erupted with speculation and outrage. Debates about the nature of evil and betrayal dominated conversations, and experts weighed in on the psychological dimensions of captivity. The story resonated not only because of the crimes themselves, but because it challenged fundamental assumptions about safety, trust, and the potential darkness that can exist behind familiar walls. Even as the girl began to receive care and stabilization, investigators continued to reconstruct the events leading to her confinement. They examined family dynamics, past interactions, and any warning signs that might have indicated risk. Romy's prior concerns, her knowledge of a dangerous family member, suddenly gained new significance. The warning that had once seemed almost abstract now appeared tragically prescient. The emotional stakes could not have been higher. The girl's story was intertwined with the murders of her captor's parents, creating a tangled web of grief, horror, and betrayal. Each revelation about her captivity added layers of complexity to the investigation, emphasizing not only the criminal acts themselves, but the human cost, the fear, the suffering, and the resilience of a child subjected to extraordinary trauma. By the end of the day, the investigators had established several critical facts. The girl had been intentionally confined. The room was designed to conceal her, and the circumstances suggested a pattern of control that went beyond impulsive behavior. These findings would inform subsequent legal proceedings, shape public understanding, and highlight the urgent need for accountability. Yet, even with these details in hand, uncertainty remained. How did the girl come to be in that hidden space? What led to her captivity? And what other secrets might the Reiner estate conceal? These questions hung in the air, unanswered, as investigators prepared to delve deeper into the family dynamics, behaviors, and motivations that had made such a tragedy possible. Romy Reiner had always been close to her parents. She knew them as loving figures, yet she had also witnessed the subtle tensions, the undercurrents of unease, that often simmered behind the polished exterior of the Brentwood estate. On the day of the tragedy, Her role shifted from daughter to crucial witness, the one whose observations and instincts would guide investigators toward a fuller understanding of the horror that had unfolded. From the moment Romy discovered her parents' bodies, she was both traumatized and acutely aware of the need to explain what she had seen. Her initial call to 911 was desperate, panicked, yet precise enough to convey the gravity of the situation. She reported not only the deaths, but also the unusual behaviors she had observed in the family over time, offering insight into tensions that, at the moment, seemed almost prophetic. It was in these early moments that Romy first mentioned a dangerous family member, a warning that would shape the course of the investigation. Investigators immediately understood the significance of her testimony. Children and young adults can sometimes see things that adults overlook. The subtle shifts in mood, the unexplained absences, the glances and gestures that hint at something hidden. Romy's observations were not abstract. They were grounded in real, lived experience. She had spent years navigating the complexities of her family, noticing behaviors that, to outsiders, might seem trivial but which, in hindsight, were deeply telling. Her reference to a dangerous family member was both a warning and a clue. While initially vague, it prompted investigators to look more closely at Nick, the son living in the guest house. Romy described episodes of isolation, moments of aggression, and behaviors that suggested a lack of empathy or understanding of boundaries. These recollections, when combined with physical evidence and the discovery of the hidden room, painted a chilling portrait of premeditation and concealment. Romy's testimony also highlighted the subtle ways that fear and manipulation can exist within a household. She spoke of moments when Nick would act unpredictably, when he would insist on privacy, or when he displayed anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation. To anyone else, these might have appeared as ordinary frustrations. But Romy had learned to read the undercurrents of her family, and she recognized that these were not simple disagreements. They were warning signs. Psychologists working with investigators noted the importance of Romy's insight. Family members are often the first to notice behavioral patterns that indicate potential danger, but their concerns are frequently dismissed. In this case, Romy's prior observations provided crucial context, helping authorities understand that the murders and the captivity of the child did not emerge in a vacuum. They were the culmination of long-standing dynamics, patterns of control, and escalating tensions that had gone unaddressed. During her formal interviews, Romy recounted specific incidents that, at the time, seemed unremarkable but now took on new meaning. She described times when Nick had insisted on certain doors remaining locked, when he had become unusually defensive about private spaces, and when he had exhibited signs of obsession with maintaining control over his environment. Each recollection, initially small in isolation, formed part of a larger mosaic that suggested premeditation and manipulation. Her testimony also illuminated the family's internal dynamics. Romy spoke of the delicate balance between love and fear that had characterized life in the Reiner household. She described how her parents had worked tirelessly to maintain appearances while managing conflicts privately, and how she had often felt caught between loyalty, concern, and the instinct to protect herself and her siblings. This insight was invaluable to investigators attempting to reconstruct the social and emotional environment in which the tragedy occurred. The phrase "dangerous family member" became a focal point for both law enforcement and the media. Reporters speculated about its meaning, commentators debated its implications, and social media users drew connections between Romy's warnings and the unfolding events. For investigators, however, it was a practical tool, a guidepost for understanding motive, opportunity, and risk. It highlighted the need to examine not just the immediate crime, but the behavioral patterns that had led to it. Romy's courage in speaking out cannot be overstated. She had just experienced an unimaginable loss, and yet was able to provide coherent, detailed, and emotionally grounded testimony. Her ability to articulate observations and provide context under such circumstances was critical to advancing the investigation. Without her insight, the connection between Nick's behavior, the hidden room, and the murders might have remained obscured for much longer. Her testimony also raised broader questions about awareness and responsibility. How often do families overlook or dismiss warning signs of dangerous behavior? How can subtle cues, observed only by those closest to a situation, be recognized before tragedy occurs? Romy's account forced both investigators and the public to confront the uncomfortable reality that danger can exist in plain sight, even within households that appear ordinary or affluent. As investigators continued to piece together evidence, Romy's descriptions guided searches, interviews, and forensic analysis. They examined Nick's movements, communications, and interactions within the house with renewed focus. Every detail that Romy had noted, defensive behaviors, obsessive routines, and unexplained absences, was scrutinized for connections to both the murders and the captivity of the child. The weight of Romy's testimony extended beyond the immediate investigation. It shaped public understanding of the case, influenced media coverage, and provided a lens through which the tragedy could be interpreted. The dangerous family member was not merely a phrase. It was a symbol of the hidden dynamics, the unseen patterns of control, and the psychological complexities that defined the Reiner household. Even as investigators worked to corroborate Romy's observations with physical evidence and additional interviews, one fact remained clear: her testimony had unlocked a crucial layer of understanding. It bridged the gap between the observable crime scene and the invisible dynamics that had allowed such horror to occur. Without her insight, the connection between Nick, the hidden room, and the child's captivity might have remained obscured. Yet, for all the clarity her testimony provided, the full story of the Reiner estate was far from complete. The hidden wall, the 12-year-old girl, and the dynamics described by Romy were pieces of a puzzle that had many more layers. Investigators understood that while they now had a clearer direction, the events that had transpired behind the walls and the motivations driving them were still unfolding. The investigation into the Reiner tragedy had already revealed shocking discoveries: the brutal deaths of Rob and Michelle, the hidden room, and the captivity of a 12-year-old girl. But a case of this magnitude cannot rely solely on immediate observations and testimonies. To truly understand what had occurred, investigators needed to construct a precise timeline, a detailed sequence of events that would illuminate how the murders were carried out, how the child had been confined, and what role Nick Reiner had played at every stage. Building such a timeline is a painstaking process. Investigators began by examining all available records: phone logs, emails, text messages, and social media activity. Each communication became a potential clue, a timestamp that could confirm or challenge witness accounts. They also scrutinized financial records, noting transactions that could indicate motive or provide insight into daily routines. In cases involving family dynamics, seemingly mundane details, like when a door was locked, when food was delivered, or when a visitor arrived, can reveal patterns that lead to critical discoveries. Physical evidence within the house also played a crucial role. Investigators examined the bedrooms, the kitchen, and the guest house for signs of forced entry, disrupted routines, or hidden objects. The placement of personal items, the orientation of furniture, and the presence of unusual materials in unexpected places all contributed to understanding the sequence of events. Even something as small as a misplaced key or a smudge on a wall could indicate movement and timing. Forensic analysis was equally vital. Blood spatter patterns, fingerprints, and DNA evidence helped establish the locations of the victims and the suspect during the events leading to the murders. Experts reconstructed possible scenarios, using both physical evidence and witness statements to hypothesize the order of actions. This process required not only meticulous attention to detail, but also an understanding of human behavior under stress. How someone might react, what choices they would make, and what mistakes they might leave behind. Romy's testimony proved invaluable in this stage. Her observations of Nick's behavior in the days and weeks leading up to the tragedy provided context for the physical evidence. She described moments when Nick had become unusually secretive, withdrawn, or obsessive about certain areas of the house. Investigators cross-referenced these accounts with timestamps from phone records and surveillance footage, gradually piecing together a coherent sequence of events. The timeline began to reveal chilling patterns. Investigators identified periods when the house was empty, when the victims were alone, and when Nick had the opportunity to carry out the crimes. These windows of time were critical in understanding both the murders and the confinement of the child. Evidence suggested that the acts were premeditated, executed with careful planning, and facilitated by the private nature of the guest house and the hidden room behind the bedroom wall. Each discovery added layers of complexity. For instance, investigators noted discrepancies in statements provided by Nick and other household members. Small inconsistencies, an incorrect time mentioned, an event misremembered, or a missing detail became focal points for further inquiry. These inconsistencies, when mapped onto the timeline, revealed opportunities where the suspect's account did not align with physical evidence, strengthening the case against him. The hidden room itself became a central component of the reconstructed timeline. Investigators examined how the child had been moved, how the room had been maintained, and how food, water, and basic necessities had been delivered. Every aspect of the girl's confinement was analyzed to determine duration, frequency, and the level of planning involved. The evidence suggested that the room had been in use for an extended period, requiring constant attention and control, an effort that implicated Nick directly in the orchestration of the crime. Witness interviews extended beyond the immediate family. Neighbors, house staff, and friends were questioned to fill gaps in the timeline. They provided observations about comings and goings, unusual behavior, and minor incidents that, in hindsight, were significant. Even the smallest detail, a delivery truck arriving at a specific time or a sudden change in routine, was cataloged and incorporated into the evolving narrative. As the timeline took shape, investigators began to see the sequence of events in stark relief. It became evident that the murders and the captivity of the child were interconnected, part of a carefully orchestrated plan rather than impulsive acts. The sequence suggested that Nick had acted with both premeditation